Okay, thanks everybody, and welcome to the next talk, which is going to be about FIL-RetroPGF-1 and transitioning to FIL-RetroPGF-2. After this talk, there's also going to be one from Kieran, who's going to talk about modeling different voting mechanism designs. And then after that, we can have a bit more of a group discussion, where it would be great to get input from everybody here in terms of how we think the program can evolve and be improved. There we go. Okay, so kind of second intro slide. So the FIL-RetroPGF is something we've been working on closely together with Juan and Kieran here, along with support from a whole bunch of different people from Gitcoin and also the Open Impact Foundation, as well as a lot of support from Filecoin Foundation, Protocol Labs, Web3 Mine, and Titan Network. So in this presentation, I'm going to give a quick run through what is FIL-RetroPGF, launching FIL-RetroPGF-1, quickly review FIL-RetroPGF-1, and then look at next steps for FIL-RetroPGF-2. But in essence, FIL-RetroPGF is an optimism-inspired retroactive public goods funding. So optimism is the first kind of large-scale application of these ideas, and what we're trying to do in Filecoin is very much inspired by this. So with FIL-RetroPGF, we're trying to put the public goods economy within Filecoin, and how we're doing this is using a mechanism which is based on impact funding, and that impact is retroactively observed. So in essence, we're trying to establish this feedback loop, and in this feedback loop, funds flow from the funder to the RetroPGF program, to the recipients, and then this benefits the whole ecosystem and therefore benefits the funder, and then through this you have this virtuous cycle. So in essence, retroactive public goods funding in Filecoin is the confluence of three concepts. One is public goods. Technically and strictly speaking, these are things that shouldn't be rivalrous or excludable. But in many cases, that's something that we may want to relax slightly, so that's something that we should discuss. It also has to account for Filecoin. It's specifically focused on public goods within the Filecoin network, and it's retroactive, meaning this is about impact that's already been achieved. And whenever you have these features together, especially retroactive versus proactive, this really facilitates setting up a kind of feedback loop and awarding outcomes, not potential, and really can work in a kind of mechanistic way that's is especially good for decentralization and hopefully for low cost also. And the goal for our first retroactive public goods funding round was to close the impact profit gap, the same as Optimism 3. And essentially what we're trying to do by doing this is to cause future impact, so to sustain current public goods projects, but also start new ones. So Filecoin's requirements for this program are that Filecoin needs to store information, it needs to do it in a decentralized way, and it needs to be robust. Our expectations are that there should be exponential growth, and this growth has requirements. The requirements are hardware, capital, and apps, but the requirements are also a whole bunch of other stuff like education, research, tooling, and community. And these things, they might happen spontaneously, but they might not, because they don't necessarily admit private profit in the same way that other things do, and yet they are welfare maximizing for the network. They do improve the welfare of the network for everybody. These things are really valuable. If they weren't there and they weren't paid for, everybody would be worse off. So we need these things. So this is precisely what FIL-RetroPGF is solving for. And a very quick just to finish off the intro of what FIL-RetroPGF is about. So essentially we have this feedback loop where we're trying to measure some signal from the community. So we do this by the community submitting applications about what impact they have created. The next step is that there's a kind of learning and computation step whereby badge holders assess those applications and say, hey, yeah, this is really impactful, this less so, and then they allocate funds on the basis of that. And on the basis of the badge holders' allocations, the funds that have been submitted to the program, donated to the program by the funders, these are distributed in order to influence and act as a kind of course determining mechanism for the system at large. Okay, so launching FIL-RetroPGF-1. Very quick recap. So in a nutshell, 224K FIL pledged by round funders, Titan, Web3 Mind, Filecoin Foundation, and PL. We got 162 nominations. 132 of those were eligible. We ultimately received 109 applications, which were attested to the Filecoin chain. 106 applications were accepted. 2 were rejected because they didn't actually have nominations. We had 25 badge holders who voted, ending on the 9th of May. And since then, 95 projects met the quorum in terms of having the minimum level of votes. And these projects, these 95 projects, have been funded throughout June and July. And I think now most of the funds have been distributed to most of those. So that's pretty awesome. So that's FIL-RetroPGF in a nutshell over the course of 3 months. Okay, so a review of FIL-RetroPGF-1. How did it actually go? Was it useful? Did it have any impact? Is it making any difference? So you can see the projects that were funded here. And of course, this is just a subjective view, but if you look at the top 5 projects, I think these are all excellent projects, like very worthy projects that are totally in line with the aims of the round. In terms of the different categories, so there were 7 categories in the project. Infra and dependencies did the best in terms of getting the largest amount of funding. And if you look at funding per number of applications submitted in the category, infra and deps like especially punches above its weight. So I think 3 of the top 5 were also from infra and deps, so Glyph nodes, Lotus dependencies, and DRAND. We also had Lighthouse, who did really well in the product and UX category, and Filecoin Orbit and ambassadors in education and outreach. In terms of breaking it down a little bit more, so we can look at how it went to really understand deeply in terms of the badge holder voting patterns. So this is super interesting, actually, and you can see it's kind of hard to understand, hard to model, hard to guess what people are going to do, because the behavior of the badge holders, which is shown in this image, is very inhomogeneous. So this image essentially shows the badge holder count on the y-axis and the badge holders' ballots or votes on the x-axis. And some badge holders were very spread out. They gave a little bit of votes to everybody. And then other badge holders were super decisive. They were like, this project is awesome. This is getting all of my votes. And they really concentrated their votes on a very small handful of projects. So it was a kind of diverse range of behavior there. And we can kind of interpret this in a number of ways. One might be that for some badge holders, the process wasn't particularly informative. So, I mean, if we think about it in a kind of Bayesian terms, we might have like a flat prior to start off with, and then people review the applications, and then they update their prior, and then this concentrates into some posterior where they're saying, hey, yes, these things are really good. Some people just didn't update. They kept it really flat. Now, that could be the reason because the process wasn't super informative for them, or it could be strategic, or it could be some other... they can truly, yeah, exactly, yeah. And they want to give everybody some votes. So anyway, it's just interesting to consider that. And we can also look at the distribution of votes amongst the projects. So this is quite interesting too. So you can see DRAND was the top rated project with no 0 votes. So it's like getting a super strong signal to the DRAND project. The signal is a lot of people think this is a high quality project. A lot of people voted for it highly, and very few people voted for it with a low score. So like that's just a super signal for that project, but there's also a signal for the other projects lower down, and that's interesting to see too. Something to note about this image. So in this image, by the way, I should just say, this shows the projects on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it shows the number, the different ballots, and then the coloring is how high the vote was in that ballot. So In this round, we had a quorum. The quorum was 5, so you had to get above this, and this is like a minimum level for the kind of the signal that's being produced by the community to have some fidelity to say, hey, yes, we should take it into account. So you can see from this image that it's actually slightly difficult to set that quorum level a priori, because had the quorum level been slightly higher than 5, then you would have got a kind of different outcome in the distribution of funds, whereby it would have been much more concentrated amongst the top ones. So there's something of a challenge there in terms of setting that quorum parameter. Go ahead, Patrick, please.
Would you be able to speak a bit more about what the 0 vote means? Because I recall it was like a negative or something. And I just wanted to make sure that I was clear on the meaning of it.
That's a great point. So the 0 point caused a lot of confusion, and I don't think it was either widely understood or well explained and set out by the team who was running it. So in essence, people could vote with a 0, and that 0 was treated just like any other number. It was also counted towards quorum. Why was it counted towards quorum? It was counted towards quorum because it's useful information that's been put forward by the badge holders. And so, like, just if you're having a company meeting, if there's like sufficient presence of people, that's quorum. It's not the intensity of the signal so much as just it being there that counts towards quorum. At least that was the logic, but a lot of people disagreed with having 0 counting towards quorum. So that's something to discuss changing in the future. But in terms of it being a negative vote, in many ways, it is just treated like any other number. So in fact, any number between the mean score will lower the mean score. So if you vote with a 1, you're probably also lowering that project. Go ahead, Molly.
Yeah, I think that this, as a badge holder, that's not how I thought it worked. So I think we have a bit of a communication thing there where from my vantage point, I didn't realize that 0s counted towards quorum. I thought it was only effectively just a negative vote of this project doesn't seem to be contributing actively to this ecosystem and deserves to be rewarded by this RetroPGF program. There were, I think 120 something different responses. We had some, members who were doing very, very broad Web3 projects that weren't very directly relevant or able to demonstrate impact, at least in their application to the Filecoin ecosystem. And so my vantage point was 0s are a negative vote, and anything 1 and above is like a positive quorum vote. So it's really interesting that 0s do actually make something more likely to be included, but with a lower score. Whereas that was my not my intention.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a paradox there. That yes, it makes it more likely to be included, but yes, it should be strictly lowering the score.
Yeah, the data point I was also going to flag, because you saw in the previous slide that there were a couple of folks that had a lot of 0s. But there was also a tooling thing where if you imported a spreadsheet into Easy RetroPGF, it would automatically give 0s to anything you didn't vote for. And so there's also a delta in how the tooling sets defaults, where if you use the web UI, then you had to manually go and give a 0 if you wanted to do that. Whereas, I imagine that those, 4 or 5 participants were, they're just almost voting across the entire subset of things. Maybe not, but especially those that are voting for 100+ projects, I think that might be a tooling thing.
Yeah, totally. Like defaults are super important, and I think we produced a spreadsheet to help people. A CSV file to help people vote, but the defaults were not so helpful. So you can see that one badge holder, the badge holder who's filled essentially the top badge holder, they may not have intended to give all of those 0 votes necessarily. But I think that's probably one badge holder, and if you look at the data, it indicates that everybody else did vote correctly. Go ahead, Juan, or Nicola.
But they give all 1s, so in a way, the first badge holder was probably not intending to give a lot of 0s, but why did they give all the 1s? So we can say that all the zeros were a software issue, but why did you give so many ones?
They were spreading the love, I think.
No, but I think the message that I'm trying to spread here is
Yeah.
that voting lower than mean
Yes.
is a bad vote. So giving ones to
Correct.
people is bad. No, it's not that it's bad. It's bad for that project.
Yeah.
And giving lower than, say, I don't know what has been the mean vote.
Yeah.
I think we should all learn what the mean vote is.
Yeah.
And trying to make sure that we only vote
Yeah.
projects that we really want or projects that we really, really don't want. But even I think the top 4
Yeah.
are the ones that increased quorum for a lot of projects.
Probably. Yeah. Totally.
And
yeah.
and that's bad because we are diluting the rewards for all the other participants.
Yeah. I mean, maybe.
But what I'm trying to say is that a project that was not good, that got a lot of ones,
Yeah.
could have gotten a reward.
Yeah.
And I think that is a bit unfair against projects that maybe got
Yeah.
like a very high score,
Yeah.
but very few.
Yeah, so listen, the thing is, there's going to be a trade-off in the distribution that we aim for. You can have a very sharp, high peak distribution with like a cusp, or you can have like a long tail and spread it out to a little bit to lower performing projects in order to try to encourage and facilitate the growth. But it's kind of hard to do both. Go ahead, Patrick. Also.
I wasn't a badge holder, so like when just looking at this,
Yeah.
I was under the impression that like giving a 1, like I would have a certain number of like votes, and I could just give like 1 to this person, 2 to this person. But I think having like an idea of what the mean is when you're doing that step doesn't feel like a good badge holder experience, because you got to know so much context about how the whole thing works, rather than just being like, okay, I've got a set number of like votes I can cast, and 1 felt I thought before I heard all this that 1 was still a good vote. It's like, oh, I'm going to give them 1 of my votes.
Yeah.
I'll give them 2 of my votes.
So it uses a mean scoring rule as a way to aggregate information from across the set of badge holders to kind of produce some sense of a reliable signal as to what the distribution of impact is. So you've got to aggregate that information some way. So mean or median is one way of doing it. There's a kind of question, is it sufficient to have like a black box almost voting mechanism? Do people really have to fully understand it to try to game it? I don't know. A very interesting comment was also made by Danny from Filecoin Foundation, who said, this is cool, but it's maybe a little bit different from the final distribution of funds that we expected. So what if instead of making it a single shot, we have an iterative process whereby the badge holders view the distribution and then they can vote again. And maybe this could repeat for a few rounds until it stabilizes at what the badge holders are happy with. Go ahead, also,
Yeah.
Lau.
One of the really interesting things that we've seen as well for example, in the newest upcoming optimism round, in which there's a different mechanism being used, in which we're voting on metrics, is that voters still want to spread the funds as most as possible. So, for example, there is the option to select metrics which are plain or logarithmic metrics, and several of the badge holders are still going for logarithmic because there's a higher distribution of the funds among several projects. So I think it would be interesting to explore that in union with the first assumption, in which it might be that it is strategic voting, in which people are actually intending to spread out the funds between as many projects as possible.
Yeah, so it could be strategic voting to try to lower other projects potentially. Go ahead, Axel, also.
I think something that is a bit counterintuitive that maybe you can explain a bit. Like, I think more natural voting that people may have in mind is like it's by sum of all the points, but you're doing it by mean of the, like when you vote for parliament, it's by sum of votes, right? It's not by what is the mean that everyone got, right? So like if someone got a bunch of ones because a lot of people want them a little bit, you're saying that's a bad thing. Maybe in a more traditional voting of sum of votes, that's a good thing. Right?
But you got to normalize it because it's a fixed pot size, right?
Yeah, but could be fixed pot size divided by distribution of total votes, but it's divided
That's the
by
mean.
distribution of.
No?
What I'm saying is that
Yeah.
he has a point, which is like there are 100 votes. Everyone has like say 10 of these votes, and you vote with the percentage of the total pot. So you could say that the winners are those that receive the most amount of votes. No, you just use the sum.
So if there's one project that everyone gave them a 1, so they have a total of 50 votes, like that's good. But you're telling me that's 1 because they have an average of 1. But in kind of more normal voting by just adding all the votes together, like that would be good. Like, yeah, no one was really passionate about it, but everyone voted for it a little bit. That's so that adds up. It seems more so that's important too. It seems counterintuitive for me to do it by mean, because I don't know, maybe you have a reason, but I would like to understand it better.
Yeah, I mean, the reason is that people are acting as individual capital allocators. So you think I'll give 80% to this project, 20% to that one, but that's just your view, and you may not be the most reliable estimator of impact. And so the way that we generate a more reliable estimate is by having a pool of badge holders. That's at least how I interpret it. Go ahead, Nicola.
But if we interpret it in this way, then we should give, say, a set amount of money to each participant, and then each participant decides how much money they give, and in that case, it's the same as the sum. So it's the same as saying, let's give money to 5 to 10 different VCs. They all invest. They might invest on the same projects.
Yeah.
But everyone has the same amount of money. And now we're saying that's not really what we did. We are for the VCs that would like to give a little amount of money, then we are penalizing those projects and we're going to give even less. And I'm not proposing to do the sum necessarily. I'm just saying that these are two different modes of operation. And here we're voting qualitatively on the projects instead of quantity in terms of quantitative. And a lot of people, clearly from here, because there is a lot of one, are voting in a quantitative way. And I think that we need to pick a model and do education. Exactly. And I don't know. There is also other. I don't know if people have experimented with other forms of voting. But for example, if we really want to limit the power of those that could give high votes in sums, maybe there is like quadratic voting, where one vote is cheap, voting twice is very expensive, voting 3 times is very, very expensive. So your budget get expired, spent really quickly.
Yeah. Go ahead, Will, also.
So I guess you could imagine just doing like everyone stack orders, everyone chooses how many projects they think should get there, and then you figure out a curve of like how quadratic do you think the funding across this total stack ordering.
Yeah,
like there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can try to pull out preferences across people.
Yeah, I think kind of wider point. There's a really big design space here, and it's totally unexplored. Well, not totally unexplored, but there's a lot of potential, and that's like something we're really interested in. And actually, Kieran's going to explore in his talk next. Okay, I'll keep going. Okay, so a quick review in terms of how do people think the round went. So we collected feedback from the application. So it's actually recipient feedback because we collected it at the time of KYC. Broad strokes, people said there was a strong likelihood of building in the Filecoin ecosystem again as a result of being a recipient. Very positive result on that, with a mean of 4.5 out of 5, and this is like a sample size of about 90 or something, maybe a bit less, but it's a relatively large sample size, a significant number of the projects. In terms of other feedback, we looked at whether people felt there was clear enough distinction between the nomination and application phases, they had enough information, whether we communicated well to people, and the website and the user interface. In general, there was some comments to be a bit more precise with the communication, make things super clear, and also make the website a little bit slicker to use in some senses. But this is the nature of running the first round. And these are all things we're going to improve for the next thing. Okay, next slide, please. And then, so what are we going to do for RetroPGF-2? So we have we collected feedback from badge holders, from the rounds funders, from the operational team, from Gitcoin and Open Impact Foundation. as well as the applicants. So there's a few things we really got to try to change a little bit, but much of this is open for discussion. So I would like you guys' input. Next slide, please. So to just highlight a few things, in terms of principles and goals, something I think we need is clear evaluation metrics. So some of the questions perhaps that we asked in terms of providing metrics were a little bit generic. They weren't quite targeted or clear enough. So having super standardized criteria for those metrics, that will be useful. There's a kind of philosophical discussion over the extent to which the round should support mixed goods. So this is Filecoin, retroactive public goods, but in reality, many goods are mixed. So to what extent do we want to explicitly support that? Another thing to consider is the first round was very general. We had 7 categories, and we said, hey, there's tons of stuff that's important in terms of public goods for the ecosystem. We need to support it all. In future, do we think it's worthwhile highlighting some target areas? For example, some people might say developing DeFi on FEM. This is something that will really help the ecosystem. Should we highlight this as a specific area? So those are some things for us to discuss. In terms of the mechanism, the allocation distribution. So in terms of like what distribution do we want to see? Are we happy with the distribution that we're seeing currently, which is quite a long-tailed one, but relatively flat? Or do we want to try to aim for and target something else? Another kind of philosophical point, it's related to the mechanism, but very much on the principles and goals of the project also, and that is in terms of whether or not we want to fund the impact gap, or whether or not we want to directly fund impact. So there's a lot to discuss there, but I mean, in essence, the nature of public goods and public goods being funded is that they are underfunded. So the gap, in that sense, is the metric we should be targeting. That's the feature of public goods, that they're underfunded. So that points to the gap, and yet trying to close the impact profit gap is problematic in the sense that it requires understanding the funding and understanding that accurately and reliably for different projects, and collecting that information in a kind of meaningful way is extremely difficult. So what we've seen in practice was a lot of teams disregarding that funding information and effectively voting based on impact. And another thing to discuss, which we already touched on, is zero voting, which was misunderstood and controversial. So we can decide whether or not we want to include that in round 2. On top of these kind of fundamental things, there's a number of process-oriented things. Like we'll try to make the submission process slicker. We try to make the KYC process lighter for the operators. We can consider whether or not we want to have applications and nominations phase. I think most people who are involved in the operations tend to think we should skip the nominations phase now. And I think a lot of applicants give that feedback also. On top of these, there's kind of wider issue that this is really cool, but we should also now try to start developing some kind of decentralized governance process around this to more effectively gather information and decide how the program should evolve. So something we might want to try to do is considering FIL-RetroPGF improvement proposals whereby people can submit proposals on GitHub, for example, on how to change the program. Okay, so that's everything. So there's FIL-RetroPGF-1 to FIL-RetroPGF-2 for the second round. We're trying to do it every 6 months. We'd like to kick it off at the end of August, but there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen. We got to have more badge holder selection. We got to iterate on all of those design goal questions that we discussed and try to think of, hey, what's the minimal set of changes that we really need to make for round 2, and then quickly make it happen within the next month or 2. On top of this, we need to secure and find more donors to fund the second round. And we're also looking at integrating hypercerts and working much more closely with drips too in the second round. So that's everything. Thank you.